Good afternoon and good evening, everybody. Welcome back to Coast EVs, your fortnightly fast charge, sort of, on EVs and infrastructure. We are back on a fortnightly cadence for the moment, but we're just discussing some changes again. So sorry for anyone who's been thrown out by the kind of weekly, then fortnightly and that kind of change. But we're here tonight, and a juicy topic coming up for us with EV adoption and a bunch of different kind of factors going into that, not least tariffs, protectionism, Tesla stability, all kinds of stuff to dig into. But we'll remind you quickly, we are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, a bunch of the normal podcast services, usually the day after by around lunchtime Eastern, so you can get your audio-only fix if you couldn't catch the live stream itself. There's also obviously a replay on YouTube to catch you up. So with that, good evening to Mr. Walter Schulze and Mr. Eric Way of the Network Architect channel and News Coolum channel, respectively. We will dive right into the news, which is kind of a follow-on from our last topic of the Tesla layoffs and the Supercharger network being a little bit up in the air. We've got a little more clarification on that in the weeks since with the reporting, but the main kind of headline that came out in the last week or so is that BP Pulse is very actively eyeing the some of the Supercharger sites that Tesla may be leaving on the table if they haven't broken ground and if they get held up in the red tape of not actually having anyone to administer the department. And also kind of actively seeking out some of the original Tesla staff who built those that Supercharger team over the years. So showing some ambition there. Who wants to take this one first? I think you've both got way more BP Pulse action in your areas than I do, but Northeast is one of the areas that they were focusing on, apparently. Eric, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, I mean, I can start with that. I've had the chance to use a few different BP Pulse locations. And then, thank you to Walter was just letting me know, I guess they've recently opened some new ones, so I won't steal your thunder on that. I'll let you speak to that. But yeah, there's one just north of Sacramento that I was able to use, and they were using the free wire chargers at the time. And I think the big news is that they went to Tesla to start buying hardware. And that was kind of my initial reaction too when Tesla announced their layoffs of their Supercharger team. Is I started to wonder, is this something where maybe Tesla sees how lucrative it would be just to sell their hardware, and maybe they're going to take a step back from owning operating and then adopt something more like a charge point model where they sell their hardware to whoever wants to install it. So either way though, we've been talking about it for a long time that we need more of these gas station chargers, more of these travel stop chargers, basically locations where people who are trying to go from one location to another. And I think BP is definitely well positioned for that. And then, of course, their connection to the European market too, right? So I think North America, I think we're underestimating the need and for the speed of the charging infrastructure build out. But I think BP at least has a finger on that pulse. So I think they recognize that there's going to be a lot of need for this charging infrastructure moving forward. So I'm interested to see what they can do with their locations. But right now, I have at least a half dozen now along routes that I would travel that would potentially be of use to me. So, that's saying something, I think.
Of course, they have Travel Centers of America as well, right, under their umbrella. So they've got that kind of pole position. They've started to come up on the NEVI listings. I know that. But if the NEVI pieces are any of the sites that Tesla is looking to maybe not follow through with, that will be one of the first places they will be kind of shopping, I think.
Well, Elon did kind of reel that back, though. It's like,
yeah,
don't jump on our leases just yet.
It's a day-by-day thing, but you could see the vultures circling right away.
Yeah.
Walter, how you followed the kind of weekly activations there, and you shared some of the BP Pulse locations that are coming on. What are you seeing on the activation side? Any kind of thoughts on where they might try and swoop in?
I do, and as other people who are watching the transition, I was curious if the BP words were just lip service or if there's actually substance to it. So I went and I looked at the alternative fuel data centers database, and there wasn't really anything much there. They announced a big giga hub in Houston, which was kind of similar to the Mercedes-Benz charging networks hub in Sandy Springs, Georgia. It was kind of like a marquee location with canopies and lots of high-power chargers, and right outside their headquarters, similar to Mercedes-Benz. And I hadn't really seen anything else, but as of late, they are actually installing new stations and activating stations. So it's not just lip service. In fact, just today, they opened 2 new stations, which is pretty significant. Prior to this, if you look at the dates on their open dates for these stations, it was very slow pace that they were doing. But since the Giga Hub opened in Texas, their pace has been picking up. So it could be that it is a legitimate land grab in the environment where one of their competitors has faltered. Except I have a measure of skepticism on that still, just because at their heart, they are a petroleum company and providing petroleum products through C-store environments. And yes, they have an existential threat with with electrification adoption. So maybe they're trying to legitimately pivot, but very likely they're being forced to out of necessity instead out of willingness. But regardless, they have a team that is installing stations. And you can't argue with the C-store amenity list, which is perfect for both people who are traveling on road trips and who are unable to charge at home for one reason or another. Being able to pull into a C-store, get yourself a cup of coffee, have a safe place to charge where there's staff present, and being able to have it in your local community or along your route. They definitely have the ubiquity that you would expect from a major player. So everything seems to be lining up, and I guess time will tell.
It has echoes of Shell Recharge for me. They a lot of activity in Europe. Whenever I go back to the UK, I see Shell Recharge is all over the place. PP Pulse has been there for a long time, but little activity over here. To date. I mean, I think that again, both of you probably have seen more Shell Recharge sites than I have, but I've started to see in the last month or two a flurry of activations around Ohio. And some of the gaps that was over in that market. And I think they start to be a little more competitive as they start to get into this Midwest area and, expanding California. But it's, again, that same question mark of how much are they really going to put behind it? It's I think they know they need to be seen to make gain some momentum, but it's how much they're actually going to be committed to it, because again, we say the North American market is pretty early on, but then there are some pullbacks in Europe. There are some markets that BP Pulse has decided to make some layoffs and kind of fine-tune its approach. Still pretty heavy into some of the European countries, UK, Germany, and obviously China. But again, it's a bit spaghetti-like, because you see, whenever we think about the expansion, Eric mentioned FreeWire. Well, they've had their own problems in the last week or two. So those locations become a little bit questionable. BP Pulse is buying Tesla's hardware, which is part of the wrapped up story of whether or not Tesla is trying to move out of the CPO game and more into the hardware manufacturer supplier game. So we always have those question marks, but I don't think any of us can be sad at a nationwide, global, really brand at least committing and starting to pay a lip service to charging in North America.
Yeah, and I would say I would give them a little bit more credit than toe dipping, right? I would say that they are suffering from the same thing that we've seen from most charging providers, and that's with the exception of Ionity, Tesla's Superchargers, and Electrify America. Most of these charging providers don't have a cohesive, comprehensive plan for what they expect to do And I think right now they literally have an office of people whose job it is to put pips on a map, and there's no strategic thinking behind it beyond that. So I think that's where we're seeing them kind of like waffling. What are they doing? Are they buying Tesla hardware? Are they buying FreeWire hardware? Are they installing like 2 at a time, 4 at a time, 20 at a time? They just don't seem to have a cohesive plan. But that's true of basically every other public charging provider right now.
Yep.
Yeah, and I would say as far as BP goes, when they look at their portfolio of properties that they're able to install into, the cost of the hardware, it does seem as though since they were going for the Tesla and the FreeWire, that they were looking for cost advantageous hardware purchases, because both those have their cost advantages. But the cost of the hardware, although it costs more than a gas pump, you have to think about it as far as TCO. There's no need to keep refueling a tank. There's no tank involved, and dwell time is higher, so your sales inside the C-store increase. And I think the cost is very easily justified for the installation of an EV charging station, as long as the demand is there. And I think we're going to get to that in a bit. I think they just see it as a shrewd business decision to install some capital. They're installing capital anyway for refreshing pumps or refreshing stores. So throwing in a couple of extra DC fast charges is not that much of a budget bump for their normal operations.
Yeah, it almost falls under marketing.
Pretty much.
Yeah, well, I mean, you think of the Pilot Flying J kind of, that's been a leading light for a lot of us when we've talked about charging network expansion. But again, really, that is 2 chargers popped into the ground. Obviously, the canopies and all the amenities that we get by the side of them are very welcome. But in the grand scheme of things, and even Buc-ee's, when you think about 100 pumps down at some of those super gas stations, throwing in a few ChargePoint Express units is a drop in the ocean compared to what's there for gas. So it's definitely early days one way or another, but they do need to be seen to be making some kind of progress. Okay, let's jump into the comments. We also have, some progression on the Tesla story. I think probably mostly stuff that's confirmed, really, more than anything else. But if we want to get into that, we certainly can. But let me go around the houses a little bit to see where folks are watching from. Lots of familiar names. So good evening, everybody. Bill in Tampa, Florida. Electrified Light Vehicles, good evening. Ariel Batista, good evening as well. Stephen Redditch, greetings from Seminole, Florida, not too far from Walter's stomping grounds. Good evening to Matt's Tech Review, who hates to ask if anyone has heard anything about the NACS adapter for GM. Walter did report on it last time, but I think that was right on the edge of the Tesla problems, right?
It's been revoked. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was going to see if you heard the same thing I did, Walter, that heard some people getting their orders canceled.
I even heard it from my own cell phone. My own parts department called me and told me that it got canceled. I had an order in and they said nope.
Okay. Back to square one. Sorry, folks. Big Barney, good evening. Hopes that Tesla's BP uses Tesla chargers. Definitely in the plan. We'll see how much they're going to double down on that after they steal their sites. Jay Donaldson, good evening. Leonard, good evening. Isn't Tritium their main supplier going under? Tritium had filed for insolvency. Again, I don't know that. My take on this and the FreeWire thing is that there are potentially a lot of people who are interested in getting into this market, right? Certainly from a capital venture point of view investment. But again, do they want to get involved with companies that have maybe overextended themselves? The FreeWire thing, I think I heard somebody was basically go around Europe organizing, pulling out chargers. I don't think that's the case in the States from what I've seen. We've certainly got a couple locally that are still there and working well. But I think, as these kind of companies that maybe overextended themselves a little bit initially get to righting the ship, maybe there are people there to kind of come in and help them restructure. What do you guys think?
It doesn't really take much for a company that's new to have orders in a pipeline stack up and not go out the door for their balance sheet to turn bright red. So I really think that's what happened. We had several large players start to pump the brakes, and inventory started to accumulate, and sales weren't occurring fast enough, and you could only sustain that for so long as a small person. My personal opinion is that what we're looking at.
Well, yeah, and I think I agree. I think there's a timing issue there because for better or worse, I think NEVI killed a lot of the infrastructure expansion that was going to happen organically. So a lot of these sites where they were already planned, ChargeNet is a good example. I reviewed that one Taco Bell site. They're working almost exclusively with Tritium for their charging hardware, and they pumped the brakes. And why did they pump the brakes? Funding, right? So all of a sudden people pause this funding, and you have Tritium trying to build a new factory in North America, overextending themselves operationally, and they just don't have the sales, the active sales on the books at the moment. Yeah, it's going to hurt. So that's why I said I think our regulators might need to do a little bit more thinking when they start to pass these laws, because some of them seem to be having a negative impact on the very companies that they're designed to help.
It's also, I mean, there's entire, talk about the Supercharger team and the great job they did. There's entire teams having to be built at pretty much every hardware manufacturer because, each state needs some kind of liaison point, and sure, they can handle them regionally. But, you look at any of these companies and there are several people in the grants and policy and funding side that are being hired there. So, I mean, it's not an entire team, but there's certainly money going in that direction to, resources around it, whether it's marketing resources, coordination,
Well, and we saw, and I keep going back to this, we saw Tesla push back on some of the California regulations and requirements for their hardware, because that's additional cost. So you look at the California database for their weights and measures certification, and there's a lot of hardware that was literally red flag just sitting in the ground for months at a time because the hardware manufacturers didn't have someone coordinating with the state to make sure that their hardware met their weights and measures requirements. So there's also this regulatory, right? You have to now hire a legal team and then the engineers to rework your equipment to make sure that it meets these requirements. So there's a lot of additional cost overhead, like you said, Steve, going into these new teams to basically just support laws and regulations.
Okay, let's finish off the greetings and get into the meat, everything here. Tyler at the Average EV, hello from Maryland, and congratulations. I think his Chevy Equinox EV has finally been built. Not sure where it is, but that's the fun stage of these early reservations. You get to track and see where it's sitting in a yard on a rail in a dealer's lot, mysteriously lingering. But those are always fun times as well as nerve-wracking. But we look forward to the content that will come from that. Vlad, hello from Detroit. Nice, interesting community. Yes, I think I would echo that. Everybody is rather pleasant, and we hope to just have a good conversation about electric vehicles and where we're heading here. And Brian is raising some points, so we'll say hello over in Minnesota. And then sort of off topic, but it seems Circle K has stalled out a bit. 2 stations here still waiting to open, maybe on the utility side, but as the months goes by, enthusiasm is waning. Walter, Circle K is biggest in your region, I think. Any thoughts on the kind of expansion where they've kind of left off?
Yeah, I'm right near the nucleus, and for me, that's not the case. There, every time they build out a bunch of stations, a bunch of new coming soon pin drops get dropped, and then you'll go there and you'll find a bunch of new chargers or construction going on. But that's unique to the Charlotte metropolitan area and the greater Southeast. Throughout the rest of the country, which Circle K is another one of the ubiquitous players. I can't really speak to their speed of deployment. I do know Texas is pretty active, but here in North Carolina, there are a ton of Circle Ks. In fact, I just went to my son's graduation. Let's see, was it last weekend? No, it was the weekend before. And I stopped at 2 Circle Ks that were just recently installed in order to get to and from the events. And yeah, Circle K is definitely very active here.
It's good to hear. So maybe it's just I know the team in general, that someone mentioned Brandon here in the comments.
Yeah, I do know they're broken into regions, so perhaps each region has some level of autonomy and is a different storyline to them or something. I don't know.
I think a few of their team moved to various different players as well. So it's again just that shuffle of, there's a lot of people in the space, moving to different either startups or to the hardware manufacturers, and just shuffling around the place. So one last couple, we've got Paul from Bakersfield, California, oil capital of California. I'm sure Eric has been through there many a time.
I thought that was Gavin Newsom's office, Paul. I
thought that was the home of the new metal band Korn from the mid-90s. I don't know. There's various different reference points there for all of us. Big Barney, greetings from Erie, Pennsylvania, I believe. And he has a good tap on what's going on in Western New York, so we'll get some more comments from there. And just a reminder that Leonard is from Tulsa, the original oil capital of the world. So vying for interest in the oil stakes down there. Okay, thank you everybody for joining. And thanks for letting us know where you are and what you're up to. We move on to the main topic today, crossing the chasm of early EV adoption. So let me toss up a quick visual here, just to kind of get the marketing academic stuff in there. So probably most people are familiar with the technological adoption curve, where hopefully most of us are in the innovators and early adopters, techies and visionaries, apparently we are called. So that's fine. That's when everyone has some enthusiasm there. A lot of people wanting to, for various reasons, want to be earlier to the technology, sustainability, interest in the environment. All of the reasons that people jump into technology early on. So it's been going great guns. We've always said, in that phase, we'll sell as many EVs as we can make, no problems. Everybody's happy. The percentages look great every single quarter. Obviously, as we know, we hit this chasm there in the last probably 3 to 6 months, maybe a little bit longer than that, which is kind of this gap between the early majority of the folks who are, not dismissing EVs at all, not denying that they would consider one, but need to be convinced that they can meet their lifestyle. They're described as pragmatists, people who are looking at maybe cost savings, or really, not so driven by the wanting to be first, want the technology to be a little bit more proven out, prove that they can get the range they need, the charging they need for their trips, and not have driving electric disrupt their lives any more significantly than maybe a little bit extra time charging here and there on a road trip. So that chasm that we're talking about is the gap in between, where all the enthusiasm and those folks in the early adopter and innovator section have been kind of saturated. And a lot of, I think, all the reporting has acknowledged that that's the case. Where it diverges from the kind of anti-EV folks and the people who are really looking to say, this is it, EV adoption stalled out, that's hit a wall, there's nobody else to buy these things, versus those of us who, present company included, I'm sure, will say that the adoption is right on track, and the reason that we're getting a lot of these stories now is the kind of pushback, the realization that this is now an existential threat, as I think Walter's called it several times, to these big, automakers who are all in on combustion, or the companies who are providing the fuel for those combustion vehicles. So what we're trying to cover tonight is, where are we on this journey? How far into the chasm are we? What are the potential barriers to adoption that we need to hurdle over, and how does it look specifically for North America? Because obviously you hop over the Atlantic and you've got countries like Norway, where there's significantly higher adoption, and every other car that you see will be an electric vehicle or more. China obviously is its own beast, lots happening over there, and I think they were above 40% now, with projections going on to half the cars being electric. We are earlier in that adoption phase, but certainly we have the interest, we have the infrastructure starting to roll out. That's why we exist every couple of weeks to talk about that. Let me see. Waffled on for a long time. Do you guys want to take that one on, or what are you? Our first thing was going to be kind of where we're at with adoption and what you see in the future here with some of the stuff we've been looking at recently.
Well, I think this is a perfect time for it, because I think, Steve, you picked the exact moment when this applies, because as I remember, early adopters really are up to about 14 to 15% intrusion into the market, right? And if you estimate about 16 million cars on average are sold per year in the United States, then before you can even approach that chasm, you need to be producing at least 2 to 2.5 million EVs a year. Well, we haven't even hit that production yet. We came close, right? But it's probably going to be this year before we even hit the production level that would be required to start breaking over that chasm. So just on a basic numbers level, until we're producing 2.5 million EVs a year, we're not really going to break into that early majority that people consider mainstream. So I think this is actually the perfect time, because I think this is the year that we probably are going to hit about 2.5 to 3 million EVs produced in the United States. So
yeah, we were at something like 1.2, 1.3 million towards the end of last year, right? 2023. So we're coming up on that. Walter, you helpfully provided, I think, pretty much the kind of catalyst for this topic with the Cox Automotive Path to EV Adoption study, which I'll just give a little bit of context to here with this visual. So some of it may be obscured, but it kind of flies against the idea that adoption has kind of stalled out and we're not going anywhere, that the majority of people do not want to consider an electric vehicle. You've got 54% of folks potentially considering an EV within the next 3 to 5 years, 2026 to 2028. Obviously, that's going quite a bit into the future. But some of these factors here are things that we'll also want to talk about, in terms of the technology needs to improve. Potentially, we need to educate people a little better about how the vehicles work, what it's going to mean for their lifestyle, what kind of performance you're going to get. And then, actually, I was quite surprised that only 36% were looking at the price reduction there. But that's a piece we'll come on to as well with the tariffs and the competition level. You put us onto this, Walter. What kind of jumped out at you as you looked over the study?
Two things. First of all, with the bell curve that you brought up that showed the technology adoption curve, which can be used for many different things. And Tony Save is very famous for describing it being like gravity, that it just is a law of nature that you really can't argue against. And we're on the adoption curve with EVs. The bell curve increases in the degree of slope as you get into the early majority. So you're starting off on a lower grade and then the grade increases. So the question is, with this EV slowdown that we're going through, are we plateauing or are we going to start to shift gears? So with the Cox Automotive, two things jumped out to me. The first thing was that in the graph that you showed, 54% in 3 to 5 years, that's of EV skeptics. So it says EV skeptics. In 3 to 5 years, 54% will be considering EVs. So there's a mindset shift in the people who are currently skeptical about EVs, that in 3 to 5 years, according to their study, they will now be considering EVs. Further, in 10 years, the EV skeptic number is going to increase to 80%. That is basically game over. And if you look at the bell curve, that lines up with what that bell curve describes. Secondly, what jumped out to me is Cox Automotive is not known as like a clean technica, environmentally centric news source. They're just an industry insider providing analytics for the automotive industry as a whole. And really the game for being a successful automotive manufacturer is lining up your series production numbers for what you believe demand might be in the future. And if you can do that successfully, you'll be a profitable automotive manufacturer. Very complicated because of the changing, vacillating desires of consumers. But according to Cox Automotive, which a lot of these automotive companies look to for some kind of guidance on what the future may hold, according to Cox Automotive, what we're looking at is, in their words, a second wave getting ready to hit starting in the second half of this year. And I actually found the words that they were using were a normal growth curve. That's a direct quote from this article. So according to Cox Automotive, we're right on script. The Tony Seba bell curve of technical adoption for electric vehicles is unaffected. We are cruising right along, no pun intended. And in 3 to 5 years, the people who are currently naysayers, according to Cox Automotive, will be considering EVs. And in 13 years, people will have an EV and always be considering an EV. And the term they're using is considering. It's not like they're buying an EV, they're considering an EV. So in 13 years, they basically say 100% of the people are going to be at least considering an EV.
It's an interesting piece, that you put that in there, the EV skeptics. I hadn't noticed that, but I think it's also a kind of flag of how, stuck in the time really the EV skeptic attitude is, because we're in an election year. There's obviously a motivation to make EVs a political football. So what you do in terms of surveying right now, even though the Cox Automotive survey obviously points to a brighter kind of piece further down the track, what the numbers you get today will potentially back up and reinforce those reports where people are trying to say that no one wants an EV. This is something that's being forced on people. But as we get further, and things start to become a little more settled, we know what the landscape is. Obviously, there are potential things that could happen at a federal level to really kind of chip away at some of the progress we've made. But I think even when that happens, we have a state level, at least half of the country, and probably more now that the Southeast is getting a lot of investment from battery manufacturers, hardware makers, automakers building their vehicles to align. I think that piece kind of solidifies the fact that even if there are a lot of there's a lot of shouting about it right now, and a lot of naysayers, skeptics, all that kind of thing, it can go away very quickly once we get into another cycle of government and whatever it ends up being. If the EVs stops being a political football, then people just go back to the age-old thing of, is it easy enough to run? Does it meet my lifestyle? Is it going to save me money?
Yeah, and there are some also hard numbers to point to that indicate that there's a problem with the selling of EVs. Volvo in particular, they decreased the XC40 recharge and the C40 recharge numbers down to below 1,000 for Q1, which is a significant drop. But they're a little bit of an anomaly. I think they've got an Osborne effect going on with the EX30 and the EX90 that they've been publicizing very heavily, but still aren't really available in large numbers. So I think that's a bit of a phantom. Although people can point to Volvo's decrease in numbers, I don't know. Overall, the growth is increasing. The rate of growth is not as much as it was previously, but that's likely going to change here shortly, because there's a lot of people who are, I think, going to start getting religion that is just a better way of traveling around.
Yeah, and I think we're still going to see, too, some predatory news reporting on this, as we've always seen with the FUD articles and everything else. They have a clip of an article talking about how EVs give some drivers motion sickness, which, roller coasters give some people motion sickness. So, but yeah, I think with that, what we're seeing is a lack of nuance. And what you'll hear from some individuals is, so I'm not going to buy this kind of car that the government is pushing on us. Like, there's this narrative that the government is pushing EVs, which they're kind of helping along, but then, note those tariffs and things of that nature, and they're kind of hurting at the same time, the timing of their programs. So they're not 100% pushing EVs. If they were, we would be much farther along in our market right now. But the other sort of nuance that they're lacking is, if an automaker struggles, they're going to blame it on their EVs. Not, so forget the fact that we have some struggling automakers that haven't done anything with EVs, like Mazda, right? Or, barely anything with EVs, like Mitsubishi. And they're struggling, but nobody's making that connection because they haven't stated that they're going in on EVs. Whereas you have Tesla, if they stumble at all, it's now a FUD news story that gets spread everywhere. So I think we're going to see more of this predatory news reporting from the media until we get to the point where EVs are ubiquitous enough where we can look at a Volvo and say, maybe it's not the fact that they're selling EVs that's why they're stumbling. Maybe they don't have the brand reach that they need. Maybe they're not interesting buyers. Maybe their products just aren't as compelling as they used to be or that they hoped they would be, right? So there needs to be a little bit more nuance, I think, even within the media and reporting these stories, and we're probably not going to see that. It's going to be black and white. If it's an EV and you're struggling, it's the EV's fault. If it's not an EV and you're struggling, we're just not going to mention it.
You touched on them, and we're on the edge of government activity, so we can't really ignore the 100% elephant in the room with the tariffs that were levied by the Biden administration this week on Chinese EVs specifically. Not a huge surprise necessarily in terms of taking that step. What do you think about the level of them? And then we need to get into, obviously, price is a factor, competition is a factor. How much is there a kind of balancing act here of, yes, we want to maintain domestic production and have a certain amount of control over the electric vehicle supply chain, but also the fact that the prices are exceptional, the technology is very good. I think there was a really good article, I can't remember the reporter's name now, but it was on Inside EVs from the Beijing Auto Show about that. It was just that it wasn't just dumping EVs and the fact that there was over production in China. It's that these are very good vehicles. These are, on a pound for pound basis, if they were in the US market, they would dominate in his kind of estimation. A lot in this, starting with the tariffs, and then I guess take it where you want, Walter, for the type of models that we could get and whether you think it's a good thing, bad thing, or a balancing tightrope to be walked.
For the first time ever, a Chinese automaker is in the top 10 automakers in the planet. That's BYD. They made it to number 9, ahead of many very solid brands. And the threat of BYD is really to other car companies. It's not to the American consumer. So I guess you could say it's to the American worker, but who's to say BYD wouldn't show up and start a automotive plant in the United States as Japanese automakers were? I know here in my home state, VinFast is been welcomed with open arms, and they're building a multi-billion-dollar facility and employing many people in our state. So it's stimulating business. I think, sadly, in my estimation, and I may be wrong, this is a political stunt in a election year, trying to have someone who's behind in the polls get catapulted forward and prep for debates and the never-ending argumentative cycle that will be the election that we're headed into. So as far as the tariffs go, you can't say that EV adoption is waning if the federal government of the United States feels it necessary in order to protect against unfair practices, a flood of EVs into our market. Because if no one wanted them, what's the threat? So the threat is that people want these cars and they need to double the price on them in order to ensure that the subsidies the Chinese government is providing in order for the manufacturer to be completed at a lower cost and sold to customers in order to gain market share is not unfairly giving them an advantage over other car makers who have been playing in a capitalist system for a much longer time and understand the rules better.
We also have the aspect of, the common argument against EVs being foisted upon us is let the free market decide. Well, this is the free market, right? I mean, obviously there's an element of, very different governance over in China, and there's a much more, if you want to go one way, they can make that happen and bring a lot of manpower to bear on it. So the ethical side of it is something to consider. But in terms of pure free market, as you say, Walter, no one's moaning about it. All you hear about Hyundai, Kia, Genesis EVs is that the South Koreans are killing it. It's a great job. These are vehicles we want at prices we want. That doesn't obviously extend that, isn't extended to Chinese manufacturers, but Eric, what do you think? Protectionism, yay, nay?
I mean, I'm just wondering, when are we going to put the tariffs on foreign oil? Or is that not a thing? No, I think I think, as Walter noted, it's political posturing, it's pandering. I mean, it would be one thing. Like, I think there are a couple of very valid reasons to say, hey, look, you can't bring Chinese EVs to the United States and sell them for whatever it was your cost is, because there's questions about how the workers are being paid, how they're being compensated and treated, how the source materials are being mined or sourced. So there's a whole laundry list of reasons why, valid reasons why you could say, I don't think that these EVs are going to be competing on the same level as, hopefully, right, the American and European EVs and Japanese EVs that are where the automakers are being withheld to certain standards of labor and material sourcing. So there is a justification in that regard. But that's it. That's where it ends, right? And I think there is just this. I think there's a fear right now that if China was able to ship their EVs directly to the United States, that they would provide so many at a low enough price point that the average American can afford, that it would be difficult to ignore that value proposition. And like you said, this kind of flies in the face of EVs being foisted upon us by the government. No, at this point in time, our access to them is being extremely restricted by the government. And so, this flies in the face. Basically, they're doing one thing and they're saying something completely contradictory. And on that note, though, I will say, I don't think that Chinese EV automakers could come to the United States and upend the automotive market. There's too much history with both domestic and, at this point, like you mentioned, Korean automakers. They've built a reputation for themselves where they've gained respect, the same as Japanese automakers, the same as a lot of European automakers. Chinese automakers don't have that respect with the US population yet. And the reviews that I've seen of actual Chinese cars on the roads in Europe, they haven't lived up to that hype. So maybe the Beijing Auto Show, they put their best foot forward. It looks like these are cars that could compete directly. But I've seen time and time again, I think it maybe CarWow, I can't remember. It was one of the European reviewers put the BYD seal directly against the Tesla Model 3. And it was getting atrocious efficiency, right? Like you're talking about their most efficient car that's supposed to slide through the air, and it's getting atrocious efficiency. It's just not living up to the numbers that were on the paper. And if that's the case, right, coming from China, these EVs, I don't think are going to necessarily make the impact that a lot of people think that they're going to make with the US market. I think they'll play a part in especially getting people into the door in EVs because of the low price. But I don't think that they're going to be, as people noted, VinFast, right? They came here and they have some quality issues, right? Well, this is a foreign maker from Vietnam, unknown to a lot of Americans, and they have quality issues. They have performance issues. They're just not going to take the market by storm. And then, just one side note, Walter, you'd mentioned BYD. They actually do have a manufacturing plant in Lancaster, California. That's where they make their BYD buses. So they do employ Americans. And I do foresee that potentially coming from Chinese automakers if they want to come to America and employ American workers paying American wages. I would be really open to that, right? So, and I think most Americans would, like you said, let the free market decide.
Yeah, and I'm going to date myself a little bit. There used to be something called a Yugo, and it was a low price thing that was going to undercut the market, and we couldn't let it in, and it didn't go anywhere because VinFast showed up and they were going to do direct sales similar to Tesla, but they didn't have any service network or anything. And then they pivoted and they're like, okay, well, we're going to work with dealers because that's really the way this is going to be supported. It takes a long time to get all that set up. So there, as you say, there is no immediate instant gratification with showing up with a couple of truckloads full of a couple of boatloads full of cars and suddenly dominating the market. As you say, that's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
Let's jump through the comments, see what everyone else wanted to talk about tariffs, so we can see if we've got any talking points there. Leonard, on the point of tariffs, thinks they will hold us back or hold back adoption. Europe and China will eventually drag us into complete adoption, but these tariffs will delay us from the loss of access to LFP. So it's lithium iron phosphate batteries, presumably. Big Barney says it's going to affect GM, Polestar, Volvo, and Ford primarily. Let's see. Trying to pick out specifically the tariff-related comments. Again, on Leonard, hope we can get domestic lithium iron phosphate production going. Afraid the Chinese companies may be unwilling to license the tech after this move on tariffs. It's kind of a dance, right? We've got to, because as much as, you know, Chinese automakers want to get into the US market, it's not like China is unimportant to Tesla, General Motors.
I don't know what kind of companies want to get into from what I'm hearing, they're saying maybe they're just giving lip service, but from what I'm hearing, they're not overly excited about getting it. They're fine with the rest of the world.
Yeah, still, I mean, there's markets everywhere, right? They've obviously got an enormous market domestically, but you know, getting into Europe and being part of that, where the EV adoption is already so far ahead and has so much more promise with, you know, regulatory kind of forcing everyone in that direction. It's going to happen there before it happens here. But I would think, I mean, the other side is you don't necessarily get the same synchronicity with the type of vehicles, right? Because Chinese vehicles in a lot of cases are going to be a little smaller, maybe, you know, they're more matched to European roads and use cases than if you come to America, you probably have to make a truck. You know, you probably have to make a massive SUV. These things are going to be a little bit different to some of the vehicles that they've already got in their roadmap.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Got to make a giant stainless steel refrigerator.
That is a unique piece of kit. Nobody else seems to have gone that way yet. It's only a matter of time, I'm sure. Remember, he's playing 4D chess, not just reacting to whatever happens. Sky, welcome. We have Chinese gas cars already enjoy the same 35% tariff imposed on imports into their country. China is just as protectionist as anyone. Yeah, I mean, this is back and forth, right? Again, we say GM wants to be in China. That's not, we've seen a lot over the years, models that have not been released in the US, but have gone over to China and done relatively well, although it sounds again like the domestic automakers there are doing significantly better now. Lisi says Chinese companies can just build in Mexico, no big deal. Then you start to get, obviously, the North American link, but and qualifying for some of the requirements of building in this region. But I would hesitate to think that will be a loophole for too long, right? I think probably more to Eric's point, if they start to employ American workers, American jobs, American factories, that's where you're going to get the most compelling argument against, you know, protectionist measures that keep automakers from China out as a whole. Big Barney says China way ahead in technology, certainly in terms of supply chain. I don't know how the technology in the cars, you know, looks compared to a Tesla or compared to a Mercedes. Even there's a lot of, you know, tech going in, from autonomy to in-car entertainment systems. Sometimes I feel like it's a race to put the most screens in a car. You know, as soon as you start to get infotainment screens across every section of the car, then it's considered way ahead in terms of technology. Yeah. Bill says Detroit survived Japan and Korea. Korea's still here, certainly. Toyota is making maybe not great strides in terms of EVs, but is certainly still going to have a say. Alan and Tiffany Yates ask, didn't Ford license lithium iron phosphate technology from CATL for a factory in the US? I mean, all of this, there is no getting away. We can talk about the cars and the models, but the battery supply, the minerals at the moment, China has a huge head start on that stuff. I think it's laudable that the various incentives have been geared towards bringing domestic supply chains back in, trying to make some progress and catch up. But there's no denying that even if you shut out automakers, the minerals in the batteries are still making it into our electric vehicles. The pieces that are all across the supply chain. China has a significant fingerprint on all of our EVs, and is likely to do so for the foreseeable future, right?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, and CATL also has a partnership, or in theory, a partnership with GM to build a battery factory in North America as well. So, I wonder too if at some point some of these Chinese brands don't just become almost international, right? They're pretty much there already in terms of their scope of operations. But when you think of national battery production, CATL, I think of them kind of like LG, right? They're from Korea, but they're an international battery company serving globally, right? And CATL falls in that same scope. So I don't know if they'll be given a little bit of latitude to work outside these tariffs, given that, but we'll see.
And they're only really as good as the administration that's implementing them, right? Because both administrations, regardless who wins in November, they're going to try and be tough on China. That's a characteristic of both. It's just what approach they take and how nuanced they get in terms of actually shutting off supply, because as we've said, there's ways to do it and there are other ways to get around it. So it's not going to be a one and done kind of, it's very much a blunt force kind of instrument to just slap a tariff on and go, well, that fixes it. It's, as Walter kind of hinted, more political posturing than actual effective policy.
So Steve, you're saying the Green Party can't win?
No, I mean, if you want to vote for them, go ahead. I think RFK has a significantly greater chance of denying the vaccines and getting into office. But veering we weren't going to avoid politics on a tariff kind of related subject, but let's keep moving ourselves forward.
I would like to take issue with the concept that China is ahead on technology that was raised. It's, in my opinion, just not the case. The American technology sector has been at the forefront for decades, and you can call out companies, and I know it's specifically not an EV, but call out other companies. The technology sector, they're all American. It's, Red Hat, Microsoft, Apple, Google, the list goes on and on and on. They're all American companies. So as far as technology, I'm pretty confident that the United States has a pretty solid grip on it.
Well, I was going to say, Walter, we've kind of heard that too, where people wanted to discount GM's contributions in China as, it was SAIC's EVs all along. But if you talk to anybody in the know, all of the electric vehicle manufacturing, all the vehicle design, all the engineering, all of that came from GM. It's just they cannot operate in China without a government-sponsored partner. Mm-hmm. And so, you give China all the credit for essentially the technology that GM provided to them just so that they could operate in that market. And so, I also take issue with this concept that China is somehow ahead in technology. It just, there's nothing I've seen that demonstrates that or would convince me that that's currently the case.
They definitely have production capacity. There's no question there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a piece of it, right? Is that we always get this argument that we can't do EVs. It's a wider objection, but it's relevant to the discussion that it isn't possible that we can't make the grid adjustments, we can't get the infrastructure in place. All that stuff always seems very defeatist, and that's not, it's something that definitely was true of the British environment after World War. But in the US, I've always thought it was a can-do attitude, and I know this is more again political posturing, that you want to deny EVs because it's too much, we can't do it, we don't want that to happen, so you point to the difficulties and the pitfalls. But if there's a country that can do it, this is the country. You get your roll your sleeves up, you get your best finest minds on it, and the technology starts to take hold. So I just take umbrage at that. It seems to be quite unpatriotic to say the country can't do it. This is too much of a big task. Done it before, we can do it again.
Well, and I'm all for celebrating innovations and advancements where it's due. Like, I think China deserves all the credit in the world for advancing LFP chemistry, right? Like, here I am in my background picture surrounded by LFP batteries. Like, these are proving to be some of the safest, most cost-effective, ethically sourced batteries available. And that's all due to advancements that have come out of the Chinese market. And they deserve all the credit in the world for that. But in terms of EV technology and overall advancement, you can't discount what's come out of the United States, what's come out of Europe, what's come out of other parts of Asia, Japan, and Korea in particular. So I think that's the other thing too, Steve, to remember is we're kind of all in this together, and so let's celebrate each other's victories, because and give credit where credit is due. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's the biggest piece, right? Is that we're not going to get there without some kind of synchronous approach. It can't always be kumbaya and hand holding. There is always going to be a political or an aspect of political theater to it, but we do need competition. And that at the current point in time, the headlines are pointing to a lot of American automakers, and to some extent European automakers shrinking back a little bit, starting to just hedge their bets. Whereas one of the theories of this kind of chasm, just to go back to the concept, is that you need to double down. You need to be all in on getting across that void to get to where Walter kind of points out that everybody in your neighborhood has an electric vehicle, that you are at that hockey stick kind of inflection point where it's not a question mark anymore of somebody trying to force you into an EV. It's just a technology that works and is starting to save you money, is better to drive, does all of the things that you could do before, but also, you can charge it at home, you can have a quiet ride, it's better for your local air quality, all of the things that we kind of have bought into for years now. But I want to switch gears as well. Don't want to miss the infrastructure side, which we always have to come back to as dedicated followers of fast charging. Aside from price and competition, one of the kind of key pointers that people always raise is we need reliability and infrastructure. The Tesla layoffs notwithstanding, there are many players. We cover this week in, week out in terms of building out national infrastructure, whether it's through NEVI funds, through private initiatives. How key is this to following that survey that Walter shared with us, that these EV skeptics are going to turn? Well, if we don't get the infrastructure right, at least in a North American sense, how damaging could that be to the adoption that we're looking to see here?
Honestly, I think EV charging reliability for public is overblown. And the reason I say that is it's easy to forget that somewhere between 60 and 80% of all Americans have access to dedicated off-street parking with metered power. So this idea that if the public charging infrastructure doesn't work, that EVs can't be adopted it's just a ridiculous concept on its face, because a majority of EV owners are rarely going to interface with the public charging infrastructure. So I mean, it seems to me that it's mostly a vocal minority, and I think a lot of it has to do with the early adopters for EVs. To tie back to that, are generally more affluent, meaning they're more likely to travel long distances. They're more likely to not have a 9-to-5 job where they're basically stuck in one location They're mobile. They have free time. They have the ability to travel. They have the money to travel. And so an EV, they buy that and they're going to be traveling. So it's those early adopters, probably the first 10 to 15% of the population who buy EVs, who are primarily going to be using the public charging infrastructure. After that point, you're going to hit a very large majority of EV owners who rarely, if ever, charge away from home. Now, that being said, though, I think reliability still will play a role, but I think it's one of those things that's going to naturally take care of itself, because as the technology sort of advances, automakers are starting to talk more with charging providers, and there's a lot more interoperability. The SAE J3400 unifying the standards, so essentially everybody is now using the same plug. I think that's all going to feed into this naturally improving pathway of reliability, including the fact that you're going to have a more diverse landscape of chargers. And say you have problems every time you go to Electrify America. Well, who cares? Now you have Mercedes, now you have ChargePoint, now you have BP, now you have Tesla, now you have any other of these. If you have good luck with a particular network, you're more likely to stick with them. And so your issues on reliability at an individual level are going to be going down, and that the complaints about reliability overall are going to be going down. And the networks that can't provide reliable service are just going to not be used, and they're going to be absorbed by another network that can, or they're going to go out of business. So I think this is something that's just going to sort of naturally take care of itself. I think right now, at least short term, the biggest issue that's impacting reliability is the vandalism we're seeing. So it was EVgo in particular was getting targeted, Electrify America was getting targeted, and now recently the superchargers have started to get targeted. And I think, whenever you have just cables getting cut, chargers getting smashed, I think that's the bigger concern at this point, is you also don't know when that sort of violence against equipment is then going to start being projected onto individuals who are trying to then use those chargers. So I think that's short term. That's where my biggest area of concern is. Long term, I think the reliability issues are going to sort themselves out.
There's a few comments that pretty much still think that charging is going to be crucial here. So we've got EVs have to be able to road trip, even if they never do, which relies on public charging. That's from Bill B. And there was another one somewhere along the same lines. Oh, there we go. From Leonard. While it's unusual to need to use fast chargers, I do still think it's essential we have reliable fast charging. I don't think that really flies in the face of anything you were kind of pointing out, Eric. I think it's just that as you said, we've had a limited number of options in the past. The only ones that were going to go out there and make these national networks were Tesla, because they had to sell cars, Electrify America, because the courts told them to, and EVgo even wasn't, maybe qualifying as a national network now with the partnership with Pilot Flying J that's getting them onto the highways. But really, those were the only two players in terms of a national capable road trip.
Well, and I think part of my point is that we've front loaded a lot of that demand, which is good, right? So once we get into that early majority phase of adoption, all of these sort of rough edges are going to have been worn down by those early adopters who travel 5, 10, 12 times a year, 1,000 miles or more at a time. Even though they only represent a small percentage of the population, they're a large percentage of the early EV adopter population.
And Bob asks, whatever happened to Iona? Any news? I don't think, Walter, you'll have any news, but I know you were very excited about them. Anything you're thinking or seeing from them? Any timelines that you were hoping to watch?
The silence is deafening, is uncomfortably deafening. So I don't know if the founding members of Iona have decided to put a push pin in this, or if it's just because they're still getting their playbook written. I don't know. So
I think
right
maybe
now I'm in the dark as everyone else.
maybe they've seen so much, tumultuous kind of headlines, and there's a lot going on. Maybe they're holding their or keeping their powder dry, so to speak, to jump in when the time is right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and if
maybe.
I can go back to the reliability comment just very briefly. I think one of the sleepers here, I know Rivian has come out with some novel way of identifying reliability, and I don't know if I'm jumping script here. I'm mentioning them that Google is baked into the center console of an increasing number of vehicles nowadays, which means that they know if a vehicle is traveling to a charging site. They will know if that vehicle has successfully initiated a charge. They will know the state of charge at the beginning, the amount of time at that station. They will know the state of charge at the end. Google's primary function in life is to harvest metadata. They'll be able to create a score for that location and provide it ubiquitously to everyone else who has a Google Android Automotive baked into the car. And so it would steer people away from unreliable stations. That's the power of Google. There's companies that live and die on Google ratings. So if your station is unreliable and no cars that have Android Automotive baked into them are showing up to you anymore, you're probably going to know the reason why is because that, you'll look on a Google map somewhere and your station has only got a 1 star. And then you think, okay, well, how do I increase that? And you're going to increase that by increasing the reliability. So those vehicles that show up and they connect and they have a state of charge at a onset and a state of charge at the unplugging, that your equipment was able to dispense it. And I think that is what Google is lining up for, because if you look at how Google operates as a enterprise, people pay them in order to use their tech. The Apples of the world pay Google in order to have them on their iPhone. And there's actually been a shift recently in the industry. They're moving more towards the Microsoft AI engine for searching nowadays, and it's a big loss to Google. But anyway, there's companies are paying to have the Google baked into the center console of their cars, and all that analytics is what Google does as their main business focus. So I'm pretty sure those star ratings that Rivian was able to accumulate and provide to their customers is very quickly going to be leapfrogged by features provided by Google.
That kind of intersects with Eric's point about you won't need to worry about the reliability because you're just going to be, you'll have so much choice. You will be guided to a place that is the best option. And again, it's all filters at the moment, but with AI coming on board, there's potential here for them to get into this place where you can literally speak a voice command to say, I want this location within 20 miles of this town along my route. I want these amenities, I want this level of power, and I want it to be available now. And you can speak the filters, your requirements into the wayfinder there, and it's not significantly different from the way Eric describes your trips right now. You're kind of doing it en route ad hoc based on how your journey is going, what amenities, what kind of sit down restaurant or fast food you want. It's not a stretch to think that they're going to put all these pieces together in a system that's already in the vehicle and extrapolate what you want within a few seconds.
And I misspoke. Fleecy is absolutely correct in the comments that it is. I misspoke. It is Google who pays Apple. I misspoke on that point. I just want to correct that. He is correct.
Yeah, and I was just going to rib Rivian a little bit, and their system can give you a grade on the chargers, but they can't tell you whether it's a 24 kilowatt or 150 kilowatt.
It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter.
Give them a little ribbon.
At least for an Ioniq 5, it's about 3 minutes difference. So don't worry about it. Just avoid Tesla superchargers if you're in EGMP. That's my filter for you. Let me run through the comments. I do think that that Rivian thing is an interesting place to kind of start looking at reliability, though. They're grading them. It's kind of like a school score, right, from A to F. And I'd love to be in one. I may even try and kind of rent one at some point once it's fleshed out, because I don't know how far they're down the line. But that could be a useful source of, figuring out which stations are looking good, at least in the interim, until Google or one of the others figures it out.
Well, and I was going to say, though, too, Steve, ultimately it comes down to the consumer experience, right? And unfortunately, right now, most of the voices talking about that charging experience are usually journalists, or a lot of times they're not people with experience with EVs. And so what we're hearing blasted at us is this unreliable. That was never an issue for Tesla, because the majority of the voices talking about the supercharger experience were actually Tesla owners, right? And so we have a very different dynamic when it comes to the public chargers. It's people speaking at us about an experience that we're expected to have, not what we actually have.
Yeah, and they're kind of reinforced by AB here that part of the reliability problem is that if you only use it very rarely, you're going to make more mistakes. So the user error is the what's showing up in aggregate as unreliable charges. But if you are kind of schooled or have done it before, or you spend a couple of road trips figuring it out, by the time you get further down the line, even the early mainstream folks who are coming in are not going to have the same problems that a reporter going out potentially looking for those issues.
Well, and that's why I approach some of these issues of charger reliability with so much suspicion, is because even when we saw that Cool the Earth survey that was out of the Bay Area saying that something like only 70% of the chargers were working, what they didn't tell people up front is that they were giving it an automatic fail if they had to back their car in order for the plug to reach their charge port. Well, we know one automaker that if you don't back in, you can't charge at all. So are they saying that they would have given the superchargers 100% fail rate? Because that's essentially the data that they were collecting. So, when I hear stuff like that, that's when I get suspicious about any reports about just how unreliable the public chargers actually are. So that's all user error.
Yeah, everything there. Let me jump back through the comments. I'm definitely behind now, so what I pick up here may be missing a bunch of good conversation that you've had, but I will do my best. Anthony goes back to the vandalism point, thinks the destruction of charging cables is more related to copper theft excuse me, than any sort of anti-EV sentiment. Yeah, I think usually when you see that, they are cut. They're not just destroyed in a kind of wanton vandalism way. They're cut pretty accurately, as much to the tip as they can. You tend to see that they are, pretty much harvesting them for the metals. I did see that someone followed up, though, on I think the Houston Superchargers, and was saying that after all of that effort, you're going to get something like $25, $30 worth of copper. Now, I guess in some circumstances, if you're desperate enough, that could be worth the effort, but it seems like swiping a bunch of stuff from a local store would get you more payoff than all the effort to go to cash in that copper.
Well, plus the brave person who walks up to a live DC fast charger with a pair of metal clippers and starts clipping away at the thing. I don't know if that would be that brave.
Active power, right? Because so that was some people's suggestion of how to solve the problem, was to make the lines live 24/7.
Yeah, for better or worse, the safety protocols on these chargers are almost foolproof. So,
yep. Then we start to get into, let's see, free charging. Very curious to see how things balance out after the free charging ends. I know I personally am road tripping more than usual due to free EA charging until next year. I would say I am going to Electrify America more because of it, but not road tripping any differently. I will still do the same road trip. Maybe I'll go to places this year that are more Electrify America friendly, but I don't think I would base my road trip specifically on free charging.
And it sounds like, I think I saw in an ID4 group that VW is also ending their unlimited. So it's now, I think, 500 kilowatt hours of free charging.
Yep. And that's, again, more on the kind of what Kia had done versus the Ioniq 5 getting the 2 or 3 free years. And I think they're going that way at Hyundai as well. I think generally they know that's not sustainable going forward. There was maybe a good tool to kind of push initially, and I'm sure it did get people into EVs just to save free fuel for 3 years, but clearly isn't tenable long term.
So what is that, about 10 or so charging sessions, maybe 500 kilowatts?
Yeah, I mean, in an ID4, yeah, 70,
Yeah.
80 kilowatt hours. Yeah, if you do 40 or 50, which it's a road trip, or it's, if you're local, maybe it's 20 sessions if you're just doing it. But again, it's not going to keep people on that charger for the entire time. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I think in general, it's just going to go back to the point of the rise of other networks. There are, with if Tesla gets these, superchargers open to everybody, it immediately spreads a lot of that burden, as we've talked about before. And if there's no difference, if it's just based on, you're going to pay 50 cents here, 60 cents there per kilowatt hour, then that starts to become who do I like, who do I know who's reliable, which site in my area gets less traffic, all that becomes more of a local consideration, I think.
Well, and EVgo in the last 2 quarters, I think their network usage was 50 and 53 gigawatt hours. So that's a lot of throughput that they're taking that would have otherwise gone to other networks.
And they have, in terms of pure site location with the Pilot Flying J networks, they have the most desirable locations. I mean, the pricing is, as we've touched on, starting to get a little out of control in some places, but if they can keep it within, spitting distance of the other networks, then it's clearly the nicer site to go to in most cases. What else have we got? All kinds of technical stuff about EA. Just pretty simple sentiment there. Public charging is crap. That's from Big Barney. I haven't found that quite so much, but everybody is entitled to their viewpoint there. I don't know that we need to go much more on infrastructure. We're at 1 hour and 16 minutes. We can do one more topic. Is there anything that came up that you guys want to kind of pull in on, or we can go to a couple that I had in my pocket for backup?
Oh, you're done on the infrastructure, huh?
I think we cover it most weeks, unless there's anything you want to kind of pull out. So.
Yeah, the only other thing that I was going to say is I have heard murmurings now of some of the local sites in my area getting the J3400 updates. So some of the charge point sites in particular. So we should start to see J3400. And I think I did see a comment earlier. It might have been Big Barney again as well. The 2025 GMC Hummer EV, I think it was the SUV. People were surprised because it's not being shipped with the J3400 plug. And I think that's a disconnect that people maybe aren't getting right now, is that my understanding is the automakers were going to start doing the J3400 plug in 2025, not model year 2025, but that means production, so as production starts in 2025, that's when they're going to start making that transition, which would make it the 2026 model years that are going to be receiving the newer plug. So I think it maybe is just a coincidence what happened with the superchargers, and it's not like they're balking at adopting the new standard. I think it's just that they had no plans of starting this early with the J3400 plug.
Well, I mean, it was obviously the NACS announcement was around this time last year, right? A little bit later in May. And you'll get the constant comments of why there are CCS1 sites still rolling out. It's going to be that way for the next couple of years. Everything that was in the pipeline around that time still kept to be in the pipeline. Nobody was really ironing that out until maybe the start of this year. Now we'll start to see towards the second half of this year, J3400 plugs on the same places as CCS1, maybe retrofitting the CHAdeMO or just getting a new unit in the ground that has both, but they are not going to be dominating the landscape other than at Tesla locations, obviously, until way down the track here.
What's this law? I mean, the NEVI site that you went to, it was a Tesla site, but they had CCS1, no?
Yep, exactly. Yeah. It had to have, that's the first site actually that had the payment terminal and all the other pieces that's at least activated, but they can't activate that site, as far as I understand, without it being, a NEVI site, without it being CCS1 compatible. So even at the Tesla sites, you're going to get the magic dock or whatever the solution they go with for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, there's talk of it changing, but right now it's written law.
Yep. Unless they abandon those sites, in which case somebody else can come and put a J3400 plugin.
In which case, BP Pulse will have to follow the law.
Yep, exactly. They're going to get all of them. I think the only other piece that I had, and I don't really want to go too far down it, was, is Tesla stability essential here? We've kind of always fallen back on Tesla as the standard bearer, even when there were problems with, some manufacturers pulling back on EV commitments or showing a down quarter or any of these things. Tesla was always going up, until the first quarter of this year. It was constantly growing in terms of sales. The Supercharger network was kind of unchallengeable, really. It was always going to be, who else is going to come in? The biggest worry was, is this going to become a monopoly for Tesla? It's a constant kind of drumbeat recently of Tesla being vulnerable. I don't know that it's really that pronounced, but certainly you start to see some cracks in the armor. Do we need a rock solid bulletproof Tesla in order to kind of jump this chasm of to the early mainstream, or can everybody else, charging providers, automakers, Chinese automakers, whatever we end up having, can that mix be more than enough to kind of take us to the level of adoption we need to see?
Well, if you want me to start, I saw Walter leaning forward. Honestly, no, I don't think we need Tesla at all. And part of the reason for that is, Tesla's filling a very, there was a need, right? And Tesla stepped in and they filled it, and they ramped up to production faster than everyone else, producing more EVs than everyone else. The only one initially even close was Nissan, right, with the Leaf. And then later on, GM started picking up with the Bolt EV. But even then, you're looking at the Leaf and the Bolt EV representing a fraction of Tesla's production values. But we're going on 10 years now that we're talking about that being the case, right? Like 8 to 10 years, Model 3, Model Y came to the market, a huge impact, right? There's no arguing that those are the best selling EVs in North America. Even up to this date, they still have that inertia behind them. But in terms of moving forward, not with the production numbers that I'm seeing from these other automakers, especially GM, right? Like when you're looking at how many battery plants they're putting in, you're looking at how many battery facilities they're putting in, how many EV models that they've already designed, and an entire, production, model behind it with the Ultium, the GM Energy branding. I actually think Tesla could be out of business in 5 years, and we would still be breaching that chasm between GM, Ford, if they can keep pushing forward and lowering their costs and improving their technology, Hyundai, Kia, of course. Yeah, I don't see Tesla as being crucial to this new EV adoption, like breaching into the mainstream. And just saying it outright, I think some of Elon's recent antics do bring that into question, whether Tesla can survive. And that's unfortunate that one person can be responsible for both pushing a company, to the forefront, and be responsible for completely undermining it and dismantling it. And I think that is an unfortunate case, but I think we're at a point now where Tesla isn't needed for EVs to reach mainstream adoption.
That's a clip I can post on X and completely send the place nuclear. Walter, do you want to defuse that particular bomb or jump on top of it?
Glutton for punishment, aren't you? So, and only there's a C-store owner in my vicinity who had a CPE 250 that was getting reports on plug share being broken. The clip on the handle was broken. So I guess instead of repairing it, he replaced it with a CPE ChargePoint Express Plus with a single power cabinet. and 2 stalls. So previously he only had 1 stall, but now he has 2 stalls. And so he upgraded his equipment. And the reason we did so, I'm assuming, I actually spoke with the man at one point, and he sees increased traffic at his C-stores that have EV charging, was because it's strategically located right off the interstate, and you get people to stop by, and you get a little money on the sale of electricity, but you get a lot of money on the sale of hot dogs. Let's just say I'm the owner of a strip mall, and I want to attract a restaurateur to come to my strip mall. I spend $175,000 on trees. If I spend $60,000 or $80,000 on a DC fast charger in my parking lot, I'm going to have a bunch of EV people showing up with long dwell times going to look for a place to eat. And so the restaurants are going to see the charger, and they're going to choose my strip mall in order to place their place of business. So I think a lot of this American capitalism is just going to start to see the economic benefit for implementation of EV charging for retail types of environments. And that's really where you're going to see a spike in implementation goes. And whether it's Tesla falling away or someone else, GM falling away, who knows who's going to fall away. The need is there's going to be increased adoption of EVs in the United States. There's really no one who believes otherwise. And as was mentioned at the beginning of this, Cox Automotive is talking about second wave. So there's going to be cars on the road looking for places to charge, and there will be people who will recognize that there's an economic benefit to putting chargers on their property.
Simple as that. As long as there are EVs out there driving around, there are places of business that will want to attract them. Let me just jump quickly through the comments, get any last points as we close out here. Andy down in Florida charged at a CPE 250 in Bradenton, Florida, that had replaced 6 dispenser Chademos with J3400 NACS. So that is happening. I'm seeing that in a couple of places around the tri-state area near New York. Just individual chargers at the moment, but you'll start to see that happen more and more, certainly.
So I'll be able to get some use out of my adapter.
That's it. It's not the Electron one, is it? You got the A to Z.
Yeah, I got the A to Z.
Yeah, that's the one I got too.
Boy,
Electron is really a saga.
Yep. Glad I didn't.
Crazy Postman's got it. He's on the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, I've seen some videos there, so definitely, you can check out Crazy Postman's channel for the Electron recall saga. But on the other end of the spectrum, 500 kilowatt wireless chargers in the ground is what we need. Yes, try and vandalize something that's buried under 3 feet of concrete if you want to sell it.
If you want $20 a copper, get a shovel.
Yeah, $21 shovel. And I guess we have to end on I'm tired of lecture. Other adapters are available, folks, but we can't promote any of them. Yeah, I think we're good. Anybody else have anything they want to finish up with, or can we round out on the 90 minutes?
Well, I don't have a Twitter account, but if you tag me in that post,
you are going to be the belle of the ball. Controversial news column channel. You can go and check out all the hot takes on how long it's going to take Tesla to go bankrupt 2024. You heard it here first.
Bankrupt.
Not to the moon anymore, sorry. And plenty of coverage on the latest DC fast charging developments every week at the Network Architect channel. These are long handles, but in the replay and in my audio version, you'll be able to check the links out and go and subscribe, like these channels, because you're going to get excellent coverage on EV infrastructure more than every fortnight. Right there. Thank you both for joining us. Thank you everybody in the comments who weighed in. I know we probably only scratched the surface of these topics. Point of order, we have probably going to mess up the schedule again for the fortnightly fast charge next week, because we have Nathan King, one of the co-founders at It's Electric, who are doing great things with curbside charging in metropolitan areas from Brooklyn to Detroit and beyond. So that is all locked in and scheduled for next Wednesday, the 22nd of May. Should be a really interesting conversation, and we've been meaning to do level 2 for a long time now, so we will make an exception to the fortnight rule for that.
Yeah, curbside parking is exciting stuff. So.
Yeah, it's the place to be. All right. Thanks everyone for joining. As I say, have a wonderful evening, and we will see you next week. Cheers.
Thank you.